Some folks can turn boiling water into a life-threatening event, as if gravity, heat, and common sense personally offended them. And somehow, the real culinary crimes waiting ahead make this look almost reasonable. 1. Setting off a smoke alarm is normal, but a person in one apartment managed to escalate things by attempting to quick toast a frozen burrito directly over an open stove flame, holding it with metal tongs like they were forging a weapon instead of warming dinner. The burrito ignited instantly, which apparently shocked them, even though fire is famously the natural consequence of placing combustible objects in open flames. Instead of dropping it, they panicked and waved the burning snack around like a medieval torch, sending sparks onto curtains, dish towels, and a stack of mail they'd been ignoring for 3 months. Their genius solution was to blow on the burrito, as if they were cooling soup, not holding a tiny edible comet. By the time the fire department arrived, the only survivor was the smoke alarm, which had been screaming for justice the entire time. 2. A person decided the fastest way to peel garlic wasn't smashing it, slicing it, or even buying it pre-peeled, but placing an entire unpeeled bulb inside a blender and running it at full speed, convinced the machine would do the work nature never intended. Instead of magically separating cloves, the blender turned the bulb into a violent garlic hurricane, vaporizing everything inside and coating the entire kitchen in what can only be described as a biological weapon against vampires. For weeks afterward, guests would enter the home, sniff the air, and ask if the owner had been storing hostile pesto. The person responsible kept insisting the idea was almost brilliant, which is technically true in the same way that slipping on a banana peel is almost choreography. Nothing says culinary expertise like fumigating your own house with garlic shrapnel. 3. One aspiring home chef believed microwaving eggs in their shells would create perfectly steamed eggs without the mess, because they'd seen someone do it online, presumably in a universe where physics does not apply. The eggs detonated with the force of a tiny culinary grenade the moment the microwave door opened, sending yolk and shell fragments across the kitchen like confetti at the world's saddest celebration. The blast radius reached the ceiling, the cabinets, the dog, and a decorative bowl of fruit that now looked permanently ashamed. Rather than admit defeat, the person defended their methods by claiming the explosion meant the eggs were done, which is one way to interpret catastrophic structural failure. Cleanup required gloves, patience, and a willingness to pretend the incident had never occurred. 4. A person tried to melt chocolate by placing it directly on a bare stovetop coil, skipping the pan entirely because they believed chocolate is basically soft already, which is a sentence that should legally bar someone from owning kitchen equipment. The chocolate liquefied, burned, resolidified, and fused itself to the coil like it had signed a long-term lease. When the burner was turned back on, the chocolate turned into a smoldering tar pit that emitted a smell so sinister it made neighbors question whether the apartment was built on cursed land. The person attempted to scrape it off with a plastic spatula, which instantly melted into the mix, creating a cocoa-flavored chemical crime scene. In the end, the coil was unsalvageable, and the stovetop died a hero, having bravely absorbed the consequences of human decision-making. 5. One home cook decided to defrost a turkey by placing it on top of a running space heater, convinced this was basically the same thing as an oven but faster. The bird sweated, leaked, steamed, and eventually began to emit a smell that could best be described as carnivore regret. The heater, overwhelmed by its new role as a sauna for poultry, shut down repeatedly, forcing the person to restart it like they were troubleshooting a malfunctioning computer instead of slow poisoning their household. By the time the turkey reached room temperature, every food safety guideline ever written had begun whispering threats from beyond the void. Strangely, the person still attempted to cook it, insisting that heat kills everything. Medical professionals everywhere would like a word. 6. A person attempted to strain boiling pasta by dumping the entire pot into a colander they had placed inside the sink. Without realizing, the colander was upside down, concave side up, like a tiny metal trampoline. The pasta hit the inverted colander, launched upward, and scattered across the kitchen like carb-based confetti. Half the noodles landed on the floor. The other half arranged themselves artistically across cabinet doors, and a few heroic strands somehow clung to the ceiling like culinary acrobats refusing to come down. The cook in question responded by scooping the pasta off the floor and muttering something about the 5-second rule, which is definitely not recognized by any health authority, real or imaginary. The meal ended with a plate of disappointment and a sink full of wet, judgmental pasta water. 7. Instead of checking whether the lid was secure, a person blended hot soup with the reckless confidence of someone who believes gravity is merely a suggestion. The lid launched into the air like a champagne cork at a very unlucky celebration, and the soup erupted upward in a geyser of boiling bisque. It rained down across the counters, the cabinets, and the unsuspecting houseplant that now resembled an abstract art installation titled Regret. The person responsible tried to frame the disaster as a learning experience, which is one way to describe being publicly roasted by your own dinner. Even the blender seemed offended, its base dripping with soup like it was quietly drafting its resignation letter. 8. Someone attempted to quick-ripen avocados by placing them in a hot oven, convinced they could outwit biology in 20 minutes or less. The avocados didn't ripen. They dehydrated, darkened, and transformed into leathery green stones with the texture of volcanic souvenirs. When sliced open, the fruits revealed an interior so unappetizing it could have been used as evidence that nature occasionally gives up. Still determined, the person mashed them into a paste they insisted was basically guacamole, though it looked more like something a museum would display under the label Ancient Artifact, Unknown Use. Guests were forced to pretend it wasn't horrifying, and the avocados became a landmark case in the ongoing battle between patience and impulsive innovation. 9. Believing that temperature is just a state of mind, a person placed a glass casserole dish directly from the freezer into a preheated oven, creating the perfect conditions for a culinary reenactment of the Big Bang. The dish shattered instantly, spraying shards of glass and half-frozen lasagna across the oven like a frozen dinner had attempted escape and failed dramatically. The resulting mess defied mathematical description. Molten cheese fused to glass fragments, sauce dripping downward like a lava flow of regret, and oven racks that now resembled props from a low-budget disaster movie. When questioned, the cook simply shrugged and said, "I thought glass was heat-proof," proving once again that optimism is no substitute for reading labels. 10. Someone decided to eyeball the amount of rice needed for dinner, pouring it into a pot until it looked right, which apparently meant filling half the pot with dry grains like they were stocking a bunker. After adding an equally chaotic splash of water, they left the pot unattended, allowing the rice to expand with the unstoppable determination of a science project gone rogue. The pot overflowed, spewing rice like a starch volcano until the stovetop looked like it had been buried in a grain-based avalanche. The person insisted the outcome was unexpected, even though rice famously does exactly one thing when cooked: it expands. The leftovers could have fed a small village, or at least the person's sense of denial. 11. A person attempted to flip a pancake by tossing the pan upward with the confidence of a professional chef and the coordination of someone who should not be trusted with moving objects. The pancake soared majestically, described a graceful arc, and then adhered itself to the ceiling like a sticky culinary bat. Instead of falling back down, it remained there, sizzling slightly from residual heat and mocking the cook's ambitions. The person attempted retrieval with a spatula, then a broom, and finally gave up entirely, declaring the pancake a permanent fixture now. Days later, gravity reclaimed the pancake at an inconvenient and dramatic moment, landing on the counter mid-conversation like a long-forgotten witness returning to testify. 12. Someone attempted to make caramel without understanding that sugar can go from beautifully melted to weaponized lava in approximately one heartbeat. They turned their back for 2 seconds, and the sugar darkened into a bubbling, smoking cauldron that hissed like it was plotting revenge. When they tried to rescue it by stirring, the caramel splattered onto the counter and instantly bonded to every surface like it had dreams of becoming kitchen flooring. The pot became unusable, the spoon fossilized inside it, and the person stared at the mess with the expression of someone who had just created a new synthetic polymer. The caramel, now technically a mineral, was later chipped off with tools no cooking class has ever endorsed. 13. Equipped with more enthusiasm than reasoning, a person attempted to bake bread by guessing the yeast amount rather than measuring it. They poured the entire packet into the dough, muttering something about extra fluffiness, and set the bowl aside, only to watch the dough rise and rise and rise like it had been injected with ambition and supernatural confidence. Within an hour, the dough had crawled over the bowl, spilled down the counter, and begun oozing toward the floor like a gluten-based life form seeking freedom. The cook tried to punch it down, but it simply re-expanded with renewed enthusiasm, as though the yeast had unionized. The final loaf was a balloon-shaped monstrosity that tasted like disappointment and raw power. 14. Someone thought a pressure cooker was basically just a faster pot and opened it the moment the steam started sounding annoying. The lid launched upward with the force of a small missile, ricocheted off a cabinet, and released a storm of half-cooked stew into the kitchen atmosphere. Vegetables landed in places vegetables have no business being, and the walls took on the appearance of an avant-garde food mural. The pressure cooker, humiliated by the abuse, clattered loudly before settling into silence, undoubtedly contemplating early retirement. The person, wiping soup from their eyebrows, announced that maybe it wasn't ready yet, which is putting it mildly for a device that literally warns users it can explode. 15. A person attempted to marinate meat in an aluminum bowl filled with acidic vinegar, unknowingly reenacting a science experiment that should have remained theoretical. The acid reacted with the metal, turning the marinade into a chemical cocktail that bubbled suspiciously and began dissolving the bowl like it had personal vendetta against cookware. The meat turned an unsettling gray, as if preparing for a role in a low-budget zombie film, and the entire kitchen filled with a metallic aroma that made guests subconsciously check whether their tetanus shots were current. Still, the person insisted the food was probably fine, demonstrating a level of culinary optimism matched only by the bowl's structural collapse. Ultimately, the meal became a tribute to both chemistry and misplaced confidence. 16. Chaos began when someone tried to refresh stale bread by running it under the tap like they were watering a houseplant, then tossing the dripping loaf into the oven with the hopeful certainty of a person who thinks hydration is a universal solution. The bread emerged not revived, but transformed into a steam-powered brick, hissing slightly as if protesting its own existence. Cutting it required the strength and determination normally reserved for lumberjacks, and every slice produced a fine mist of crumbs that coated the counter like culinary snowfall. The person responsible insisted the method works in bakeries, which is true only if those bakeries operate inside fever dreams. Guests attempting to chew the bread maintained polite expressions, the way people do when participating in rituals they don't understand but fear might summon something. The loaf eventually retired to the trash, still faintly steaming, as though contemplating revenge. 17. Things took a thrilling turn when a person tried to test whether oil is hot enough by splashing a few droplets of water into the pan, confidently reenacting the world's cheapest fireworks display. The oil erupted into a violent bubbling rage, launching droplets into the air like angry miniature comets. The stovetop crackled as though auditioning for a disaster movie, and the person responded by leaning closer, convinced they could visually interpret the meaning of boiling chaos. When the largest pop sent a sizzling droplet onto their sleeve, they reacted with pure indignation, as if physics had betrayed them personally. The kitchen briefly resembled a battlefield of spattering oil and flailing limbs, each pop punctuating yet another terrible decision. The pan, meanwhile, continued reacting exactly as hot oil always reacts to water, by protesting violently and without apology. A thermometer would have solved everything, but some people prefer to communicate with heat using only optimism and poor judgment. 18. Culinary innovation collapsed spectacularly when someone attempted to soften butter faster by placing the entire wrapped stick under a desk lamp, assuming the heat of a light bulb would gently coax it into spreadable perfection. Instead, the butter began to melt unevenly, forming a glossy puddle under the paper, like the world's saddest crime scene. Rather than abandoning the experiment, the person adjusted the lamp distance with the meticulous care of a scientist, unaware that the butter was now migrating across the desk in slow, determined waves. By the time they returned from checking a recipe, the butter had dripped onto the floor, seeped into the cracks, and developed a sheen so reflective it could host solar eclipses. The eventual cleanup involved paper towels, denial, and the realization that buying pre-softened butter is not the moral failing they once believed. The lamp, having unknowingly participated in this culinary tragedy, shone with quiet remorse. 19. Dinner plans spiraled when someone attempted to multitask by boiling water and simultaneously taking a shower, trusting that water operates on the honor system and would obediently simmer until their return. Instead, the pot boiled dry with the determination of a marathon runner, finishing at all costs, scorching the bottom until the metal darkened like it had witnessed unspeakable things. The room filled with a smell reminiscent of burnt hopes and early regrets, and by the time the person re-emerged, the pot was emitting faint wisps of smoke like a disappointed spirit. They stared at the ruin with disbelief, as though water evaporating, its signature move, was an unforeseeable betrayal. Attempts to salvage the pot required scrubbing, soaking, bargaining, and eventually the acceptance that some cookware simply chooses retirement. The stove, still radiating heat, silently begged for an owner with a more realistic understanding of chemistry. 20. Trouble erupted when someone tried to speed up frying by cranking the burner to maximum, convinced that higher heat meant faster cooking, because apparently they believed food behaves like an impatient employee. The moment their chicken hit the pan, it charred instantly, releasing a plume of smoke that unfurled across the kitchen like a dramatic stage entrance. The outside crisped into a blackened shell while the inside remained so uncooked it could have starred in a nature documentary. Undeterred, the person sliced into it, only to discover the tragic contrast of burnt exterior and raw interior, a combination that should be filed under culinary crimes. Their explanation was simply that restaurants do it fast, completely ignoring the minor detail that restaurants also possess training, equipment, and functioning thermometers. The smoke alarm, which had been silent for years, seized its moment to shine, screaming judgment from the ceiling. 21. Disaster struck when a person attempted to season an entire dish using only smell, sniffing spices over the pan like a sommelier evaluating wine, and tossing in generous handfuls whenever the aroma felt right. By the end, the pot contained enough cumin to supply a small restaurant and enough paprika to stain a sidewalk. The resulting dish was so intensely seasoned that each bite delivered a sensory experience somewhere between culinary enlightenment and direct assault. Guests politely described the meal as bold, though their eyes conveyed a silent plea for mercy. The cook, completely oblivious, took their satisfied sniff as proof of success, unaware that seasoning with one's nose is only effective for creatures capable of fully understanding fragrance concentration, such as bees perhaps, but certainly not humans. The leftovers were exiled to the fridge, where the smell successfully colonized multiple shelves within hours. 22. The quest for kitchen efficiency derailed when someone attempted to chop vegetables using a dull knife, convinced that sufficient force could make up for the blade's complete refusal to participate. They pressed down with the determination of a lumberjack, causing the carrot to rocket sideways off the cutting board, ricochet off a cabinet, and land somewhere near the family pet, who wisely vacated the room. Unbothered, the person continued sawing at produce with the enthusiasm of someone who believes friction is a cooking technique. Each slice required a level of effort usually reserved for home renovation, and the final pile of vegetables looked less chopped and more coaxed apart through brute existential pressure. When asked why they didn't sharpen the knife, the person claimed it was fine, demonstrating an impressive ability to deny evidence presented directly by reality. The cutting board, covered in skid marks, filed for emotional support status. 23. A moment of strange logic unfolded when someone attempted to cool a pot of soup by placing it directly into the refrigerator while still boiling, as if the fridge were an industrial machine designed to extinguish magma. The fridge door barely closed before the heat began condensing into thick clouds of steam that fogged up everything inside, coating shelves, condiments, and innocent leftovers in a fine moisture film. Meanwhile, the refrigerator's motor launched into full panic mode, whirring louder with every passing second as it attempted the impossible task of wrestling molten liquid into a safe temperature. Eventually, the door was opened to reveal a damp, sweating appliance that looked like it had just finished a triathlon. The soup remained scalding hot, somehow managing to defy thermodynamics entirely. Surprisingly, the person insisted the method almost worked, proving optimism can survive even inside fogged-up chaos. 24. Culinary chaos erupted when someone misread a recipe calling for 1 clove of garlic and instead added an entire bulb, under the assumption that garlic is measured the same way as fruit. The dish immediately transformed into a pungent force of nature that could have legally qualified as a vampire deterrent system. Every bite delivered an aromatic uppercut, and even the pan seemed to hiss with disapproval. The person responsible tasted it, winced violently, and still insisted it just needs a little balancing, as though there exists any ingredient capable of neutralizing enough garlic to alter the Earth's rotation. After one bowl, the house emanated such intensity that neighbors likely wondered whether a garlic festival had exploded nearby. The leftovers were eventually tossed, but the scent lingered like a myth, haunting the curtains long after its culinary reign ended. 25. A stunning lapse in judgment occurred when a person attempted to use powdered sugar as a substitute for flour, because they were both white, demonstrating a level of logic normally associated with malfunctioning robots. The batter became an unmixable sugary sludge, clinging to the whisk with the desperation of a dessert announcing its own failure. When baked, the concoction puffed up dramatically, then collapsed into a sticky crater that looked like it had been formed by a meteor made of frosting. The surface crackled with caramelized sugar, while the center remained a molten swamp. The person attempted to cut it, but the dessert clung to the knife like it feared abandonment. They proclaimed it a creative twist, though creativity generally involves intention rather than accidental candy engineering. The pan was never the same again, having endured an experience that should qualify for hazard pay. 26. Catastrophe arrived when someone attempted to thaw frozen ground beef by placing it directly on a hot cast iron skillet without breaking it apart, creating a meat monolith that cooked only on its outer surface while remaining frosty at its core. As the block sizzled, it released pools of moisture that hissed dramatically, giving the illusion of progress while the center remained stubbornly frozen, like a culinary iceberg quietly judging everything around it. The person poked at it with increasing frustration, flipping it repeatedly as though rotating the problem would magically solve it. When they finally managed to chip pieces off the edge, the skillet resembled an archaeological dig site. The resulting meal contained sections that were simultaneously overcooked and undercooked, an achievement in itself. Food scientists everywhere would cry, but the meat block remained indifferent. 27. A moment of wild creativity backfired when someone attempted to invent a new sauce by mixing every condiment in their refrigerator, claiming professional chefs do this all the time, which is accurate only if those professionals work in chaos-themed amusement parks. Ketchup, mustard, mayo, soy sauce, hoisin, sriracha, relish, and something unlabeled merged into a thick, ominous swirl that looked like it might develop sentience. The cook tasted it with bold optimism, only to recoil instantly as though they had just licked a battery dipped in regret. Despite this, they insisted the sauce might pair well with something, though no food deserved such treatment. The bowl eventually had to be dumped, scraped, rinsed, and emotionally released. Even the sink gurgled like it was offended. 28. Dinner aspirations disintegrated when a person tried to make mashed potatoes but skipped peeling and boiling entirely, instead mashing raw potatoes directly with a fork, because the blender will smooth it out later. The resulting mixture was a crunchy paste that resisted every attempt at persuasion. They added milk, then butter, then more milk, eventually producing a slurry with the appearance of wet gravel. When they finally attempted to blend it, the blender groaned like it was reconsidering its career path. The mixture remained defiantly raw, offering the tactile charm of construction material rather than food. The person still described it as rustic, which is technically correct if rustic now means structurally unsuitable for eating. The potatoes died heroes, thwarted only by human ambition. 29. A moment of misguided enthusiasm unfolded when someone tried flambeing without understanding that alcohol is, in fact, flammable. They poured a generous amount of rum into the pan, then leaned in proudly as they lit it, creating a fireball impressive enough to qualify for special effects work. The flames shot upward, licking the air with the enthusiasm of a dragon waking from a nap. The person leapt backward with the reflexes of someone reconsidering their life choices, while the pan continued blazing like it had entered its action movie era. Eventually, the flames subsided, leaving behind a scorched pan, a traumatized meal, and a person who announced, "That went better than expected," despite evidence to the contrary. The smoke lingered like a disappointed ghost. 30. The situation collapsed elegantly when someone tried to lightly toast nuts in the oven, set a timer, then wandered off to fold laundry, answer a text, water plants, and evaluate their entire life choices before remembering the nuts existed. By the time they returned, the baking sheet held what could only be described as carbon cubes, tiny, smoldering monuments to forgetfulness. The oven released a plume of nut-scented smoke that activated alarms, startled pets, and convinced neighbors the kitchen had spontaneously combusted. The person stared at the burnt remains, poked one, and declared it maybe salvageable. which was wildly optimistic for something that crumbled into ash on contact. The nuts had officially transitioned from food to geological artifact. 31. Culinary harmony shattered when someone attempted to froth milk using a whisk attached to a power drill, convinced they were merging engineering with artistry. The drill spun at ferocious speed, launching droplets of milk in every direction like a dairy-themed sprinkler system. The bowl vibrated, rattled, and eventually toppled, sending a tidal wave across the counter. The milk-coated walls, appliances, and a nearby fruit bowl that had never expected to participate in this madness. Undeterred, the person declared the experiment promising, which was bold, considering the kitchen now resembled the aftermath of a dairy explosion. The drill, still humming, seemed confused about its career trajectory. The milk never frothed, but it certainly traveled. And that's our grand tour of culinary chaos, proof that kitchens are dangerous mostly because people exist. Now pick the dumbest disaster in the comments and tell me what madness I missed. Like, subscribe, survive,